Is Nick Chubb the best running back in the NFL? Now, some of you guys might scoff at that statement, but there are some things to back that up. He was number 2 in rushing yards in 2019. He did it behind a bad offensive line, and he was the most consistent thing in football for most part for one of the most inconsistent situations in the entire NFL. So I want to put my hand into this argument, who is the best running back in the NFL? And I feel like with arguments about running backs, we always focus on 1 or 2 stats. And I found these arguments are usually unhelpful and not very much entertaining at the end of the day. So I wanted to take a different step in a deeper dive into this question, because I do think it's an interesting question to ask if Nick Chubb is the best running back in football. Sure, there are guys like Derrick Henry, Ezekiel Elliott, and Christian McCaffrey that all exist, that are all very good, who can all claim in one way or another to be better than Nick Chubb, but as a overall running back, is anybody better than Nick Chubb? Well, let's talk about it. Real quick before we get into this video, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ding that notification bell. The football season is coming soon, fingers crossed, and you want to be subbed here and notified, so when I drop all this content during the football season, you know where to find it. So again, guys, hit that subscribe button, ding that notification bell. Let's get into the video. Now, the first question that is going to be asked here when it comes to Nick Chubb being the best running back in football is, how in the world are you going to determine that? So in order to determine this, what I did was I picked the best 4 running backs of last year: Christian McCaffrey, Ezekiel Elliott, Nick Chubb, and Derrick Henry. I took everybody's rushing stats in their last 2 seasons against top 10 DVOA run defenses. Why did I do this? Well, I felt like with running back stats, sometimes they can get easily skewed because you can have a big day against a pretty terrible run defense and run up your numbers and make your cumulative stats look a little bit more impressive than what they have the right to be. So just by recording what they did against top 10 DVOA run defenses, you can have a better picture of who is really performing against the toughest situations and who is not. It evens the playing field and it gets rid of the bad competition argument, because the only rushing numbers that are going to be recorded are against the best rushing defenses in the NFL of that respective year. Now, of course, there are going to be some other variables that are still going to be factored in. Receiving stats are still going to be important when trying to factor in whether a running back's more versatile, and also the ranking of each running back's offensive line for each year as far as run blocking goes is also going to be very important. So with that stated, I think I did find some interesting things about these elite running backs, and I'm going to start with the first guy, who is now Derrick Henry versus top 10 run defenses. He had 11 games in 2 seasons where he played top 10 run defenses. In those games, he had 12 attempts per game, 64 yards per game with a 5.33 yards per carry average. Now it's interesting because Derrick Henry does have the highest yards per carry of any of the running backs that I'm going to talk about today. But I actually feel like his numbers are the least impressive of all 4 running backs, and here's why. The biggest thing to me is that of these 11 top 10 defenses that he played in the last 2 seasons, only one of those defenses he played this season, which was his breakout season where he had his most production. Also, a season where he happened to have the 4th ranked run blocking offensive line in football. In 2018, when he played 10 top 10 run defenses, he had the 17th ranked run offensive line, and he didn't have as much success. In fact, if it wasn't for his massive 238-yard, 4-touchdown performance against a 7th ranked Jacksonville Jaguars run defense, these numbers would look below pedestrian. Now, I'll give credit to Derrick Henry where credit is due. He went through a hell of a stretch in 2018 where he played a top 10 run defense for like 6 weeks straight, which is not easy by any stretch of the means. But if you just look at his numbers during that stretch, it's not really impressive what he did there. And you can see how the Titans had a wavering amount of trust in his ability against these tougher defenses. Take that with the fact that most of his production, and the reason he's even in this conversation to begin with, is from his season this year where he just didn't play more than 1 top 10 run defense all season, and you just start to see the cracks coming under the surface for Derrick Henry's argument to be the best running back in football. Because now what he did last year was winning the rushing title and having an amazing stretch at the end of the season just seems less impressive when you realize he did it against lesser competition than everybody else he was competing against. And when I say lesser competition, I am strictly referring to the run defenses he had to play, because that's his competition. Now, Christian McCaffrey against top 10 defenses, he played in 12 games. In those 12 games, he had 15 attempts per game, 59 yards, and 3.93 yards per carry. Now, on the surface, his splits may look less impressive than Derrick Henry's, but there are some things to consider when talking about Christian McCaffrey. Without stating this up front, Christian McCaffrey is also a 1,000-yard wide receiver on top of almost getting 1,400 yards on the ground last season. Also, what he did this year was extremely impressive, even if you don't consider what he did as a receiving back, if you just talk about what Christian McCaffrey did as a pure running back. Because this year, he played against 6 top 10 run defenses per DVOA, while also being behind the NFL's worst rated run blocking offensive line. So while Derrick Henry's numbers are very nice, but when you look deeper, you can start to see that they're a little bit more fluffy than people give credit for. Christian McCaffrey's numbers, on the other hand, aren't as nice, but if you really look into it, he earned those numbers a lot more than Derrick Henry did. And that's why I think his numbers are a little bit more impressive than what Derrick Henry did. But here's where the argument kind of falls short for saying that he's the best running back in the NFL. And it's just this small thing, and it's kind of a nitpick, but at this point we are splitting hairs between these great backs, and it is because he tends to be less consistent against top 10 run defenses than literally any other running back in the conversation. If you need an example, just look at 2019. He started with a very impressive 128 yards on 19 attempts with 2 touchdowns against the Rams' number 10 run defense. Then the next top 10 defense he played was the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and against Tampa Bay, the number 1 run defense in the NFL, by the way, he put up abysmal numbers on the ground. He had 16 attempts for 37 yards. He had 22 attempts for 31 yards, which has the distinction of being the worst game recorded by any running back in the conversation versus a top 10 run D. But then against Tennessee, another top 10 run defense, he went off. He had 24 attempts for 146 yards. He's inconsistent. You never know what you're going to get out of him. And I don't even think the competition is what makes him inconsistent. I just think when it comes to the ground game, his offensive line was so bad last year that he just was inconsistent because he had to make so much happen for that team. So what that means is that Christian McCaffrey is always going to put up some impressive numbers cumulatively without breaking a sweat, quite honestly. He's that talented. But I do worry about the consistency from a game-to-game basis, which for a running back I think is a little bit more important because, yeah, it's great if you can give me 125 and we're winning by 3 touchdowns, but if I really need you to give me 70 each game to win by 3, I'm going to need the 70. I'm going to need the consistency. And Christian McCaffrey, whether it's his offensive line or just him, doesn't have that consistency quite yet. So I think this conversation actually comes down to 2 running backs, Zeke Elliott and Nick Chubb. And I know this goes against the grain of what a lot of other people are saying. Maybe Derrick Henry, maybe even Saquon Barkley, for whatever reason, is in this conversation. But these are the 2 guys that I think have earned their place in that conversation, Zeke Elliott and Nick Chubb. Now, again, if this were a conversation about raw numbers, hands down, it'd have to be Zeke. He has more yards in the last 2 years, 2,791 to 2,490 than Nick Chubb has. He has more touchdowns in the last 2 years, 18 to Nick Chubb's 16. And he's been a much more productive receiver. He's also a great blocker in the backfield in the last 2 seasons. Again, 987 receiving yards and 5 touchdowns to Nick Chubb's 427 and 2 touchdowns. So done deal, right? There's not much of an argument for Chubb over Zeke. Well, there isn't until you start to really consider some other factors. Now, again, I said Zeke Elliott, he had more rushing yards than Nick Chubb, and that is true. But if you also consider that in the last 2 years, he has had over 115 more carries than Nick Chubb, and that Nick Chubb actually averages more per carry than Ezekiel Elliott. Nick Chubb averages 5.1 yards per carry to Zeke's 4.6. And yes, while you could argue that Nick Chubb would have less yards per carry if he had more carries like Zeke Elliott, I would disagree, because it's not like I'm taking this from a small sample size of Nick Chubb. This is almost 500 carries worth of a sample size, which I think is fair enough to say that he has a better yards per carry rate regardless of Zeke's extra carries. So sure, Zeke might have the higher cumulative numbers, but the numbers suggest that if Nick Chubb were in the same exact situation as far as just carries and targets goes, he'd be more productive than Ezekiel Elliott by almost 300 yards. Now, you factor this with the fact that Nick Chubb has been running behind the 32nd in 2018 and the 17th ranked run offensive lines, while Zeke has had the 3rd and 2nd ranked offensive lines when it comes to run blocking in the NFL. And you start to see where a real argument can be made that Nick Chubb is a better back than Ezekiel Elliott at this section of their careers. Now let's talk about what they did against top 10 defenses. Ezekiel Elliott played 14 games against top 10 defenses. He had 23 attempts per game, 91 yards per game with a 3.95 yards per carry, while Nick Chubb versus the top 10 run defenses had 9 games, 17 attempts per game, 70 yards, 4.11 yards per carry. Now let me stress this. Any running back in this conversation is putting up elite numbers in that context, but these are the two most elite of all of them. And not only are they the most elite, they're the most consistent out of all of them. Again, Zeke is going to average more attempts. He's going to get more yards, but he also does less per carry than Nick Chubb does. And both are consistent. And again, both are consistent and both are productive enough as receivers to where that doesn't really negatively factor them out of this conversation. The biggest difference between these two situations is, ironically, well, their situation. Zeke has been in a good spot to get his numbers since he got drafted. He has had a top 5 run blocking offensive line and a coach who has no problem giving the ball to his running back. While on the other hand, Nick Chubb in the last 2 years has had like 3 head coaches. I think he's going on his 4th one. All 4 of those guys have had wavering and different philosophies on how much they should run the ball. One of them, Hugh Jackson, actually had Nick Chubb, who is in the conversation for best running back in the NFL, behind Carlos Hyde and Duke Johnson on the 3rd string. And then once Nick Chubb finally got to play, he got the reward of playing behind the 32nd ranked run blocking offensive line in football. Now these situations actually look to flip in Cleveland and Dallas, because Dallas is having more and more questions about their offensive line. They're switching to Mike McCarthy. It's a different philosophy on the offense, and the Browns are trending in the opposite direction. They signed Conklin, they drafted Wills, they improved their offensive line, they hired Kevin Stefanski, who signed like 45 tight ends, and it seems very obvious that they are committed to running the ball a ton this season. And it makes sense to have that assumption because Kevin Stefanski's offense in 2019 led the league in rushing attempts in 2019. So for those reasons and those reasons alone, that's why I believe it's reasonable to believe that Chubb is going to edge out Ezekiel Elliott and actually become the NFL's best running back in 2020. But let me know what you think. Do you think Nick Chubb is going to be the best running back in football this upcoming season? Do you think the situation is right for him? Or do you have somebody else that you think is going to take that crown from him? Are you a Derrick Henry guy? Or you think David Johnson's going to have a resurgence in Houston? Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. But again, guys, thank you guys for watching. Have a great day. Have a good night.